Hello, this is Nate and 2/3 of the rest of the Grail Country crew today. Shari and Jed are here, and we also have a special guest, Michael Martin, joining us as we launch our new series on meditations on the tarot.
Okay, everybody show your version of the book.
Oh yes, yes. Let's everybody show their version.
Yours.
Oh, yours is very worn. I can see. Oh, you got the Kindle.
Yeah.
It's 30 years old.
Oh wow, that's great.
Oh wow.
So yeah, Michael kind of joins us in this conversation as kind of a subject matter expert. So we're hoping that that he can help give us some insight and see what we might be missing. And also, anytime people are coming to something with fresh eyes, we might actually incidentally benefit with Michael with something that he hasn't noticed before. So let's just dive into the discussion, and whoever wants to open with like their initial impressions on the first chapter on
Are you guys having connection issues?
Yeah, I can't hear Nate very well.
No, Nate's glitching.
Nate, you sound like kind of like Max Headroom or something right now.
Are you on dial-up?
Yeah. No, I'm actually on. I have an 800 megabyte connection.
Okay.
I just have a house full of teenagers that, I have extra teenagers right now. I have a teenage stepdaughter, but she's got friends over, and like massive streaming going on continually. So high bandwidth. That's one of the reasons I have a high speed connection. But yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, it was definitely on my end. So yeah, I was just kind of opening the floor to initial thoughts to kind of prime the pump. Anyone want to?
Well, I thought maybe it would be nice if someone could give us a, brief history of the tarot, just for the sake of it.
Oh, okay. Michael, do you want
to? Well, it was, there are all these legends about it. Like it was, a special occult book that kept secrets in public, that was, some people trace it to the gypsies or to Freemasons in ancient Egypt, but
right.
I don't know about any of that, but I do know it was a pretty popular card game.
Right.
Yeah.
In late, early modern period, there in Mozart's letters, for instance, he talks about playing tarot, but not like casting fortunes or doing divination, but like we would play poker or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how that game is played, actually.
Poker?
Would be interesting to find out how that was actually played.
Oh, the tarot game.
Yeah, the tarot game.
Well, I did a little digging because when I was looking at the cards, and like there are what do you call them? Suits in the tarot, right?
Yes.
And it reminded me of this game that they play in Switzerland, which is kind of like the Swiss national game. It's called Yas. And so I just Googled, a comparison between the two. And apparently they still play. So it's not related. It's not related, but they're both very old games. And but in the Romanche part of Switzerland, which is I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's like kind of the mountainous Graubünden, Davos, Arosa, all that area. They play troku, it's called, and it's tarot. Right. They still play it, and it's I read some Swiss websites, and they were saying that it's unfortunately it's dying because the young people aren't playing it anymore. But I did find the rules of the game.
Oh, really?
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I can. I don't know if I can find them on my. I'm so technologically challenged. I have it as a link on I can send the link to Nate, and he can send it to everybody. And then.
So I know the first like actual evidence that we like the oldest extant deck that we have is from 14th century, so late 14th century, 1377. So.
Yeah, it's like late Renaissance kind of.
Von Balthasar. Yeah, right.
Coming out of like that humanist movement of the Renaissance itself. And it seemed like these were a constellation of things that maybe developed into what we have as tarot today. But that was kind of what I'm not super familiar with the history, but it seemed like it was kind of just in the symbolic lexicon of Europe of the time, and then it just kind of develops into these games and these decks, and they get used for a lot of different reasons, which is kind of interesting, coming from, a conservative Christian background where this stuff is, the devil's tools. It was very interesting to see that, no, this is, some people do use it for divination purposes, but it seems to me that, like, Tomberg in his book and others that I've begun to pick up is that this is much more about it, also a spiritual development tool, like as he talks about, like the enzyme, like this is a catalyst and a kind of a reading of that world of symbolic imagery and a different kind of language. And so I found that to be really an interesting entry point into this, using something that maybe, like that esoteric side of Christianity, like
Right.
This was a good introduction into seeing, like, oh, these are really actually quite valuable tools and perspectives for spiritual development and understanding, which was kind of a very eye-opening experience as I started exploring this stuff, which was like started a couple years ago, I think.
Right.
I had another question.
I did. Go for
sorry.
it. No, it's
Well,
okay.
just to help me understand, I need to lay a little foundation for my my exploration. Arcana. I kept stumbling over this word, right? So the major arcana are trump cards. I get that, right? But what is it on the like the symbolic level? Is there like a nice short definition? Is it like archetype? Is it
like mysteries?
Mysteries? Okay.
Well, it's like kind of, actually he says it's lower than a mystery in the text, right? So it's like Arcanum is sort of like the enzyme, as you were mentioning, Jed, that like kind of opens the door that makes you able to enter into the mystery. And he thinks that basically all mysteries are tied to the great mystery, which is the mystery of the second birth.
Right.
Which is the great initiation.
Okay.
Right. And the arcana, like the major arcana, are kind of in terms of like between the major and the minor arcana. Like the major arcana are kind of the like foundational symbolic order is kind of how I have come to understand. Like it's whereas the lesser arcana are kind of more tied to everyday life and the the ordinary vicissitudes of life. Like the major arcana are kind of like the major archetypes for life in general, and like for the spiritual life. So he's only going through the major arcana, right? In this
right
book.
And he basically says they're typological symbols, which is like the above below correspondence, and as opposed to mythological symbols, which are related to time instead of space. So just one quick thing I wanted to add on the origin question is, like, I did notice I kind of skipped ahead to the afterword because I saw it was written by von Balthasar for this edition. So I couldn't resist, so I just kind of wanted to see what his comments were. And he does seem to take the connection to gypsies as to be credible, but he doesn't take the rest of the mythical origins seriously. But he does seem to think that that date was first practiced amongst the gypsies seems to be
as divination, you mean?
Potentially.
Yeah.
But I mean, or just the presence of the cards, like, probably came from, they were adopted like by the Italians from the gypsies, presumably. He doesn't go into great detail. He just seems to think that the gypsy connection is credible.
Well, but then where do the gypsies come from? That's the big
Well,
question.
they're called gypsies because people thought from Egypt, but they actually seem to have come from India.
Romani.
So, but from the East for sure.
Interesting.
That's beautifully ambiguous. I like it.
Right. It's really not known for sure. I mean, it's still kind of there's a lot of different theories, competing theories. So yes, and yes, we should say Romani. Gypsy is considered a offensive term, but the reason for that, I mean, Egyptian is the connection. That's why gypsy. It's a shortening of Egyptian. So yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. So
Well, one of the things too, I kind of like it, maybe this is just an interesting question to explore is, and I'm kind of curious. I mean, I have my sense of it, but why why would why is the tarot a useful tool for Christian contemplation and spiritual development, right? Because these are
right.
things that, like, in certain Christian communities, these things are kind of like verboten, right? You
Well,
don't go there. So what is it about? And I think Tomberg does develop some of this in his, in that first chapter there on the magician.
I mean,
But
well,
why
look at the
would a
vocabulary.
Christian take it seriously?
Well, look at the vocabulary of the major arcana, right? It comes straight out of medieval Catholicism, which is probably why a lot of Protestants think it's dubious, But I mean, the Pope, the devil, the Emperor. The Empress. All these things. That's a vocabulary of medieval Christendom, which is why I think it's so, in a way, easily accessible to someone from a Christian background, right? Especially from a Catholic background.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. Tomberg is very careful, like always in his text, to always bring things back into a fairly orthodox Catholic context. And he's very clear about like what the role of this is. And so what he says in the text is that, like, the reason they would be of worth to a Christian is that they function as true symbols. So it's very much like what he's doing is very akin to like what Jonathan Pajot is doing in his Symbolic World channel. It's like it's about like it's to make you aware of that above below correspondence, as well as the the importance of myth, which is that time access.
I found, not that I'm smart or anything, but I found a little quote in the on the Wikipedia page by Ouspensky that I thought was really good. So I'll just read it. The fact that we question the tarot as to whether it be a method or a doctrine shows the limitation of our three-dimensional mind, which is unable to rise above the world of form and contrapositions or to free itself from thesis and antithesis. Yes, the tarot contains and expresses any doctrine to be found in our consciousness. And in this sense, it has definiteness. It represents nature in all the richness of its infinite possibilities. And there is in it, as in nature, not one, but all potential meanings. And these meanings are fluent and ever changing. So the tarot cannot be specifically this or that, for it ever moves and yet is ever the same. And I was kind of shocked that was an Ouspensky quote, actually. But there it is.
So just looking at the structure of the chapter, I think that the key part is, for me, is he kind of, where's it at? When he actually just summarizes the meaning of the magician card, and I want to find the exact right here. So this is kind of the heart of this chapter right here. Learn first, concentration without effort, transform work into play, make every yoke light, or make every yoke that you have accepted easy, and every burden you carry light. Like that's like the heart of what he's saying, that the symbolic meaning of the magician is. And I just, when I was reading that chapter, I was very shocked to find that as he went into detail in discussing what he meant by that, what is meant by concentration without effort, and what is meant by turning work into play, I actually found myself like thinking a lot of John Vervaeke's work. Because to me, he's talking about about participation. Like that's the kind of knowledge he's talking about. Like it's not propositional knowledge. It's maybe there's a procedural element to it, but it's because of the because of the unconscious nature of it, while being concentration at the same time, it's really most properly understood as relating to participation.
Mhm.
Well, I think also a lot of the ideas that Tomberg develops and draws on come right from Rudolf Steiner.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is one of them. I mean, and he kind of transposes it a little bit, but Steiner's thing is moving from meditation to intuition to inspiration,
Mhm.
right? And the way I can relate to it, I mean, this kind of concentration without effort is in, like, for instance, and I think comes up in sociology, right? Is that this ability to be present to something and to let it move through you, but you've undertaken, a certain degree of discipline to get there. Like, for instance, playing music,
Mhm.
right? So you can't just pick up a guitar and improvise if you haven't studied how to play the guitar.
Right.
Mhm.
So, and I think that's part of, and that's how, when I read this book years ago, that's how I was able to hook into that, is, and because when you do that, when you learn how to, and it doesn't just happen in music, it happens in all kinds of domains. Then all those things, work becomes play. You know what I mean? I'll never forget when I was a young musician. You work your butt off rehearsing and playing and doing all this stuff. But what I noticed, I was about 22 or 23, and I was in this band, and we've been playing a lot of gigs. And all of a sudden, it got to this place when we were playing together that everything was almost done by intuition,
Mhm.
right? And jazz musicians do this with improvisation, right? That you're still relying on the scaffolding of your discipline and study,
Mhm.
but it's coming to a new place.
Mhm.
And I think that's what the magician represents.
Yeah, it's
or how to
mastery.
describe it.
I mean, the card itself is beautiful because he's holding the stick and the ball in the tips of his fingers, right?
Yeah.
Like that image to me is just, it says everything. It's talking about not possessing, like I've taught my granddaughter to knit, for example. And that's one of the things that she has to do, is she has to learn to hold those needles on the tips of her fingers, right? If she's grabbing them like this and trying to knit, like, it's not possible. You can't. You gotta use all your fingers, and and it's the same with music and anything actually. And what came to mind when you were talking about music was, when you are in that place where you have the ball and the stick in the tips of your fingers, you can be playing like an amazing piece on the guitar and talking to your audience at the same time. Right? Which you couldn't even dream of doing when you were starting out. You couldn't talk while you're trying to learn how to play the guitar. It was impossible.
Yeah.
Well, and that's kind of like the interesting thing too, is that, like, I think there's this tremendous appeal to become the magician, right? Because to get to that place where you can concentrate without effort and you've transformed work into play, that's a great place to be. If you're a musician, you're kind of playing in the pocket, and you found that groove. You have, like, it's a whole different experience of reality. But then to me, like, also in reading this, is like, with a sense of spiritual realism, is that to get to that place requires an immense amount of effort. To get to the place where concentration comes without effort.
Right.
And I think he gets into that in his sense of, like, his discussion about this. I don't remember if it's in this chapter specifically, but in a sense, this is a kind of a Christian yoga. It's a practice. It's a contemplative practice that puts you in a position to get to that place in life, right? And that kind of attainment, but it comes through real effort. And I think that even in the way that maybe tarot gets used in kind of contemporary, like, kind of new age circles telling you how you know what's upcoming for you in life, love, romance, all that kind of stuff, is it's kind of, we're wanting to use it to get to that good stuff, but in the easy way. And what's interesting about Tomberg's work is that it's like, no, this is, I mean, the work itself is incredibly challenging, but I think it lays out for me a sense of like, here is the immense effort that the spiritual life will require of you to get to the place where it's no longer effort.
That's exactly it. Is he showing how that applies also to the spiritual life, like this kind of like concentration without effort that turns work into play. It's like this is a principle that is the principle of mastery that applies to the spiritual life as much as to anything else. So for Michael, you know, it might be music. For me, it's like, I mean, for me, it's cooking. I used to be a chef, and it's like that's the thing that I do like on autopilot. Like, you know, I can definitely like do very dangerous things with a knife while talking to someone, and and have no worries.
There is that aspect to it, but I have to wonder because there is an element of childlikeness to it.
Yes.
Okay. And I always worry that people are going to go, you know, and try to, you know, I'm going to learn how to do, you know, kind of thing. And it's the art of learning. That's what he says. It's
yes, he does.
Art of
it
learning,
is,
right?
yeah, the art of learning.
And there has to be like, it's almost like what came first, the chicken or the egg thing here, because there has to be a lightness in your step to begin with, I think. I mean, that's my own experience.
This is where the piece where I think, see what you guys think of this. This is, I think that Tomberg specifically doesn't bring in, but I couldn't help but think of, particularly since I listened to the conversation between John Vervaeke and Esther Meek recently. And I'm wondering if we shouldn't pay attention to the role that love plays in this.
Well, that's what I was just going to say. I was going to say,
okay.
Like, he makes the point that this is not something that someone can teach you. Okay. This comes from above.
Right.
And that is through the second birth. Right.
So it kind of is implicit, even though he doesn't explicitly say it. Like, if you understand what he means when he says that, like, really there's only one master, right?
Yeah.
And the rest of us are all students.
Right.
That if you understand like what the meaning of that one master is, then that does tie it to this connection to love.
Yeah.
Well, this is interesting though. I do think he hits on that. When you said that, I want to say this is like page 4 or 5, so it's really early on in the chapter. So he's speaking of the initiator is above, the initiator being Christ himself.
Right.
And here below, one meets only the fellow pupils. They recognize each other by the fact that they love one another.
They love one another. That's right.
And so he's speaking about
like
the Christian hermeticist is not a master. Like, we serve a master, but we're not masters ourselves, and we're recognized by the love we have for one another. There are no longer any more masters because there's only one soul master who is the initiator above. So I think where I'm seeing Tomberg's point here is that however this is expressed, its ultimate expression is manifest in our ability to love and connect with each other. Right. So the Hermetic knowledge is not just some like esoteric, like hidden thing that does not pull down into the realities and vicissitudes of life. If you're getting this knowledge, it is filtering into the way you're actually engaging the world.
Right. But it's not work. It's play. So
what's so funny about that, Shari, is like I see that he has these wonderful dualities throughout the whole chapter where it is work and it's not work. It's, you know, it's like those, so it's like kind of the coincidence of opposites, and these polarities are like this expression of unity. Like, so I'm talking about, it's going to require immense effort. And you're like, it also requires play. And it's like, the answer to me would be like, that's basically, you're right. Like, I wouldn't say this versus that. He's kind of a this and that.
Yeah.
Throughout the whole.
I'm not versing it. I'm not saying versus. I'm just, I'm always worried. Like I said before, I'm always worried people are going to try to make something happen. Because that's what we want to do, right? We want to make things happen, and things just happen. Actually, more in reality, they just happen mostly. I mean, we can set that ball in motion, but we never know the outcome, right? Like that's the future. We don't ever know the outcome. So yeah.
Well, maybe Michael, I'm wondering, like, in your experience as a musician, where you have kind of those magical moments that just happened, like, what would you what would you recognize as some of the ingredients that are informing that? Because I'm sure, like, I've seen it happen where my friends are on stage and they just go to a different place. Like, a musician can transport you there.
Right.
Like, what do you feel like, in your experience there, that what is it that comes together when it just happens?
It's that everybody's present.
Yeah.
And because if you're not, because you can be playing and be thinking about other stuff, right? But if you're in the moment, if you're right there and you've done the requisite legwork, and it's really beautiful. I mean, one time we did a recording session a couple of years ago, and we didn't have anything planned. We're going to do this song, and we played it through one time, and we said, and it was not guys I play with all the time, and guys I play with sometimes. And we said, what, I think it needs something in the middle. So we wrote a bridge right there on the spot, played, and we cut the thing live on the first take. It was like, okay, what do we do now? But those guys are really good musicians, and we were all just in tune with each other, and we just let it happen. It was a beautiful thing. And that's what I think happens when you witness performances like that. There's a structure and there's a spontaneity at the same time.
Right.
And that's when things come alive. I mean, in any domain.
Yeah.
And that's what I think.
Well, and there's a lot of groundwork that has to be laid before you're capable of that kind of spontaneity and creativity. Like, you have to have like a very developed skill set before you can do that.
Right.
And you have to have your fundamentals down.
And that's in a way what Tomberg does throughout this book is he performs that in every chapter. Right. And he performs contemplation in every chapter.
Yeah.
In a way, he kind of goes out on, where's he going? And then he comes back. Let's return to the card.
Yeah.
Right. He always centers it. And without his amazing erudition, right?
That is
he
impressive.
Couldn't put all that stuff together. He couldn't come to intuition to connect it all.
Yeah.
Well, and that's where when he's talking about like the principle of analogy, right? What is really unique about him is that he is pulling together really some vast domains of thinking that you may not be able to make a connection to, in terms of basically a very rich Catholic metaphysic with some of his explorations in the yogic traditions, and then his exploration of the Hermeticism, and he pulls them together in like this seamless garment.
It's interesting what he says about the erudition too, because he's like, it's important. He actually says, like, in the forward, he says, like, the erudition is not for the sake of erudition. The erudition is to show you other spirits that are on this path and to introduce you. Yeah, exactly. Which is great. And it does seem like, honestly, it genuinely feels like that's what he's doing, because of like how relevant each little piece is, and it's amazing. It's really an amazing piece of writing to synthesize all that together.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And I wanted to back up though, because when Michael, when you were describing when you are able to be present in that group of musicians, is like it reminds me of kind of the tenor of the book itself. There's this sense of like concentric participation, right? And so I'll bring up like a fun musical story. Like I have a lot of friends who are great musicians as well. I'm not a great musician myself, but they were playing a small show down in San Diego, and they kind of art rock, like Euro pop type stuff. Like there would be like Sigur Rós or Mogwai, like very instrumental, like really beautiful music. But they had this one track that they had been experimenting with, where they were looping Mormon Tabernacle Choir's recording of Amazing Grace. And then they just had like a wall of sound that they brought in behind it. And there was almost like this alchemical moment at one of these shows where they slipped into a place as a band on stage where they were somewhere else. And that had like this concentric, like this ripple effect throughout the audience where something came over all of us in this experience. It was really a transcendent experience where even as, you know, in the audience, you're looking at people there and you're like, are you in this moment in the same way that I'm in this moment? And so it's that kind of that magician principle is not just, it's not just inwardly focused, like becoming like kind of like a sorcerer or a wizard or something like that, is the ability to pull people into that participatory event. Because if you're in that magician space as a musician, right, you're inviting those people in to a different way of being and interacting with the world, because it's just it's almost like that flow state, you know?
Yeah, well, that's true of like anything that's like, I mean, this is another way to talk about this other than mastery would be artfulness, right? It's because we're talking about things that are done with art. And anytime you're doing something with art, it's never just for you. It's always inviting other people into that same act of participation that created
Well, it's
it.
a creative act. That's
Right.
why.
Right.
Yeah, and it opens up, like when you see somebody else, when you're pulled into somebody else's creativity, it becomes an impetus for your own. It becomes like a launching point into like, I all of a sudden a whole new realm of possibilities.
Yeah, exactly. It opens up
me.
the possibility of the possibility horizon for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to kind of see that, I mean, even without it being like, I feel like it's a deeply sociological work, even though he's not, you know, a sociologist.
Oh, yes, it is.
himself.
Where do you just wait till you get there.
Yeah, I know he quotes Boma in it. So.
Oh, he gets super sociological.
Yeah.
Okay.
A few letters.
Yeah.
Unmistakably.
Well, we'll get there. So I just wanted to back.
But what we're talking about, that, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that is the sociological proposition, that
Yes, it
that
is.
idea of being present to let something come through.
Yes.
Shine through,
Right.
right.
Yep.
And what we're talking about. In fact, I was just thinking while you were talking, Jedediah, that one time I was playing with these guys, and I don't know what, I can't even remember if it was a gig or a rehearsal, and we got into one of those places and we stopped, and I don't remember who it was, but one of the guys said, well, this is like mysticism.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It is though. It really is. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
It's not like, I actually, it's not even like, it is.
Yeah, because we use the language of in, right? Like we get caught up in, we're in something when that's happening. And well, it's relationship that we're in. That's love.
well,
Right. Well, that's the connection.
This,
right? Absolutely.
Huh?
I don't know if you heard the story, but what they used to have, like in Muslim countries, in Muslim Spain, they would have these like all-night dances, right? Where there's kind of almost a kind of a Sufi thing. And when once in a while somebody would just get lit up, you know, while they were performing, and the people in the audience would start to go, Allah, 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 which became Ole.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, I did not. Oh, wow. Oh, very
And there's
interesting.
I have some friends who were dancers when I was in Chicago, and I forget the term, right? But they were talking about that exact, you know, kind of Spanish Muslim concept of dance, where they push the body to the point of exhaustion, and then the body keeps going. You get through that wall. So it's like this expression where the Allah and the Ole kind of concept is like something else has taken over, like within the dance itself. And it's like once the dancer has kind of exhausted themselves physically, they enter into this new transcendent space at the end of that, where the activity continues, but the pain to get there has dissipated. It was a very, very beautiful concept.
Mm.
Yeah.
I don't remember the word for it. There's a specific Spanish term for it.
Oh yeah,
In
duende.
flamenco. Yeah, duende. That's right.
Duende.
Yeah. Oh, I did have a question in this one, and he brings a I kind of tie a lot of these things into kind of my own apocalyptic perspectives, right? And I think there is like this revelatory element that he discusses, but I really enjoyed his discussion on the Church of Peter and the Church of John, and the kind of the role of both. And so, kind of his sense of the Church of Peter is like the kind of more of the magisterial, official, for him, the institutional church. But then like the Church of John, and this echoes some of the things like John Bear writes about in his writings about John, right? Is that John is like this kind of the spiritual master that starts this school, right? The school of John is big in John Bear's work, is that it's a place of kind of spiritual growth and development that serves the church and the world through the invitation into this new way of experience, right? And so I think like, as I look at kind of what I see emerging in our world today is like that coming together of the Church of John and the Church of Peter, but really that the Church of John kind of leads the way in a sense, where the institutional church finds herself kind of struggling in some very profound ways.
Right.
Is there's this need for a new revelatory moment of encounter, like, because we've had this long-standing doctrinal development, abstractions, and filtered through modernity of, we kind of know what the thing is, what Christianity is, but we're missing that apocalyptic connection that animated that first movement. And it's that spiritual movement that brings us back into it. I found that to be an interesting point of connection as far as just the role of kind of the hermeticist and the esoteric element of Christianity. I think is an exciting place that I think, tying into these communities, seeing the value of what they can bring to religious and spiritual communities overall. I think that's where the apocalyptic moment is driving us, is into that, the need for a more esoteric practice. I don't know, that was just an impression that I had. I don't know if anybody caught on to any of that.
No,
That
was kind of, I was interested in that because this is an area of tension for me, because he seems to be, to me, I see a little bit of internal conflict, because you remember the section you read earlier about like, there are no masters, only the master above. But then he's very clear that, it is the appropriate role of Peter to be the head of the church, and John is the heart of the church. So there seems to be a tension there. And then later on, he interprets the myth of Cain and Abel he interprets its cause to be a failure to recognize hierarchy. So which is it? Are there no masters except for the master above? Or are we supposed to recognize the importance of hierarchy and to see like the Peter as the head of the church to be a permanent and legitimate function? Or is there maybe some point where if the church is to become fully the church, then it needs to be the one true master above needs to be the head of the church and not Peter?
Well, I think it's important to think about Tomberg as somebody who changes and develops over time.
Sure.
If you read, his anthroposophical writings, for instance, are not entirely different because it's the same guy, but very different in his relationship to the institutional church. And then after this book, when he wrote, if you've read it or seen it, Lazarus Come Forth, sometimes it's called Covenant of the Heart. In that book, which he wrote after he saw what was going on with Vatican II, he's like, hold on, this is not what I signed up for, okay? So So I wonder, you know, if he were alive now, what he would say about the
Right.
church,
The
right?
institutional
Oh,
church.
I
Yeah.
think he
I
would
actually-
he very well may have changed his opinion about that. But this idea of the Church of John, that's something present in esoteric Christian literature going back to at least the 17th century.
Yeah.
And Steiner talks a lot about that, and others
Yep.
as well. I think even Eliphas Levi, who he invokes as one of the masters of the tarot Christian tarot tradition, I think he talks about it as well. But it goes, I mean, and when you started talking about that, I was thinking, you know, one important, I guess, contributing stream to actually this book, this notion of Christian Hermeticism, is the Rosicrucian movement of the 17th century.
Okay.
Not those guys running around in aprons and sashes and with swords now, but the original Rosicrucian documents from the early 17th century were very different from what the latter iteration of Rosicrucianism, and those were more committed to which you could, and I think you see this in Tomberg, a kind of traditionalism, because they, you know, they were confronting both the negative fallouts of the Reformations and the increasing materialism and scientism of the scientific revolution, and Descartes in particular, and Francis Bacon. They were rejecting that, and they wanted to hold on to a more cosmological vision that the discoveries in science could be subsumed into. But it didn't happen, right? Because with Descartes, you get, you know, you cut off half of experience because you can't measure it. And for instance, I write about him in The Submerged Reality. Robert Flood, for instance, was doing the same kind of thing. And two people who followed Flood, and Jakob Burma was one of them, or another person they followed was Henry and Thomas Bond, the metaphysical poet, and his twin brother, the Anglican priest and alchemist. And they were pushing against that model because they wanted to hold on to an integral vision of religion, nature, and the human being in kind of harmony with each other, which they saw being destroyed by the scientific revolution and the kind of hardening of doctrine in both the Catholic and Protestant spheres at that time. And you can see that certainly feeds into Rudolf Steiner, and it definitely comes into this book here, when all of his many questions about what is science doing, right? Which, gosh, I'd love to talk to him about what it's been doing the last couple of years. You know,
well, you know, this kind of he actually kind of ties it back into our previous discussion that we had with John Vervaeke a little bit, because he actually says at one point, he compares what he's talking about when he's talking about concentration without effort to Goethe's Urphenomen.
right?
So there's actually a direct link there, and he actually says that. Well, he also says that, like, essentially what Christian Hermeticism is actually represents is like the common soul between art, science, and philosophy.
And that's
and
pure
religion.
Goethe right there.
Yeah, right. So,
well, I maybe I misunderstood this, but he eventually, I think he resolves that hierarchical thing that you were talking about, Nate, when he talks about the myth of Dionysus. Because,
right. Yeah.
Because he's decapitated, right? But he gets up and carries his head. and that, to me, that is the heart carrying the head.
Right. Well, this ties the kind of hierarchy. Right. This is why I'm saying there's an internal tension in the things that he's saying, because it's like, wait, the heart can carry the head. So what does that? To me, it seems like eventually, if Christ is to be truly the head of the church, right, then the body of Christ needs to be headless. It needs to be the Church of John, that where head becomes where the true head becomes the head, where Christ is the head. And it's like right there in his own text.
Yeah, but yeah. it's just yeah, I don't know how to say it. It doesn't feel like attention to me. It feels like a proper ordering of things.
Description.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because it's not, it's, I mean, I think he would probably know this better than anyone, that it's never either or, right? It's always both and. So that's how I saw him resolving that, was with that story. And it's interesting because there are a lot of myths about that, and I never thought about it in that light before. Like in Switzerland, there's a myth about two saints who are beheaded on the Limmat in Zurich, and they also pick up their heads and walk away. And so just thinking about it in these terms was really, really helpful.
Going the Green Knight, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Echoes of Douglas Harding too, though, right, Shari?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, he's completely headless, right?
The Headless Way. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the heart carries the head. So that was really, really good for me.
Yeah.
What's interesting, Nate, I mean, I think you and I are pretty similar in our like suspicion of hierarchy.
Yeah, we're the
like,
rebels.
Yeah,
You're not alone.
Yeah. And I think probably Tomberg is definitely, I see him having kind of that traditionalist bent that I can appreciate it, but I don't possess that myself. That's not a space that I occupy. But I think like there's a sense where like the hierarchy, I think there is value in it kind of as scaffolding, right? When it doesn't get mistaken for the structure that it's accommodating, right? But but eventually, like scaffolding, like in the completion of any building project, that goes away, and then there's the dwelling place that is not. I mean, obviously, there's levels and layers to any building. Like I grew up in construction industry, by the way, Michael. So that's kind of a common metaphor I might return to, but. I think even I see that in the traditionalist impulse is that wanting to reintegrate the scaffolding into the building, and as opposed to seeing it functionally for what it is, there is some value in it, but it only in a kind of a tentative and impermanent way, because I think that the thing that the hierarchical thinking, what it is an inhibitor to often is actually participation, right? And I think I see that in kind of institutional Christianity is it becomes kind of this professionalized caste of like the ones who are doing the Christian life, but what is missing is the sense that this is really an invitation for all, and that each and all has a unique contribution to play to the whole that is not, any more or less valuable than, whatever the role is. So, the person who maybe is not what we would say is not spiritually initiated may still within that community have tremendous gifts to bring to bear for the community.
Right.
Yeah, Tomberg.
And so I think his tension there is he has that tension, but I think he also, maybe he's writing it because he is a devout Catholic. There are certain elements I would expect throughout his writings that's going to be he's still going to defer to the magisterium, to the Church of Peter.
When he started writing this book, he'd only been a Catholic for about 15 years.
Right.
Okay.
So I think what I see, having at the time when I first read it, I didn't see it, but I see it now, having known that I'm old and having lived through it, is that you see in him what we see now with a lot of enthusiastic converts to Orthodoxy in particular. You see a lot, or into Catholicism. So Protestants can convert to Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism, and they get totally gung ho. They're more Orthodox than the Pope, right? They're pulling out all the stops. They want to walk around in Beretta all the time. And that's, so I see that, but I see the other thing that I see that he's doing with this Church of John, Church of Peter thing is that's his dialogue as a kind of esoteric Christian, as a
Yes.
Christian hermeticist, with the structure itself.
Yeah.
With I wouldn't call it the hierarchy. I mean, we could call it that, but I would call it the structure of the institutional church, and trying to not only describe that in 1964 or whatever it was when he started writing the book, but also through time. Through time, there have always been these esoteric, or I wouldn't even call, the thing is, we call them esoteric. If you go back to the Middle Ages and the late early modern period, they weren't esoteric. That's what that was called Catholicism at the time. So astrology was part of it, right? There was no one thought anything was wrong with astrology then.
Well, even like John Calvin used astrology, which is really interesting. I mean, it wasn't a separate from astronomy, I guess. It was a single science at the time.
Right.
And so what I think he's doing is, so he's describing that relationship, and what gets left out of that relationship, even though he does mention it all the time. Because if we think about it, so you get Church of John, the esoteric Christians, the Church of Peter, the kind of institutional Christians. And but then there's what we could call most Christians, who aren't interested in kind of this intellectual trip of understanding all this arcane stuff, or even understanding all the fine points of dogma, the typical parishioner at a church. Most people are just like, can we just have the sacraments and tell me when Christmas is, right? So those people kind of get left to the side a little bit, because Tomberg's concentration is the relationship of this intellectual stream of Christian Hermeticism to the intellectual stream, say, of scholasticism or, church tradition.
Right.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was.
And
that's exactly what I was trying to say. Is like they're within the normal Christians, which often are the most refreshing kind, right? Because they're not, they haven't kind of. It's just a part of the life that they're living. So they're viewing it in a way. A lot of times, like my experience is in a more integrated way, and it's not because they're trying to integrate it. It's just this is the important part of our life, that showing up on Sundays and making sure we're there on Christmas, Lent, Easter, all the major church holidays. Is there's like a rhythm of life that they find themselves in, that there is a wisdom in it that becomes instructive. And I think that there's not a value placed on just the ordinary Christian, among kind of the Christian intelligentsia. Like, well, we've got to have we've got to become very mystical, or we have to become very doctrinally precise, or whatever it is that we all like to go into. Is we forget that this is abstracted oftentimes from just the domain of life on the ground, where people have incredible amounts to give. I think that's been one of the things that I have loved about growing up in the trades, is being close to the just the grittiness of life, right? Of, getting to know the guys, your foreman and your journeyman, and seeing how hard it is to make something, to build a structure, how much effort goes into that. And it's just with ordinary people showing up and doing their job kind of thing. And all of a sudden something amazing there's this amazing result at the end. And I think that ordinariness is something that is also an important and under celebrated aspect. Even if you want to get into sociology, I think there's that ordinariness of Sophia that is, one of her most beautiful attributes.
Well, he's very careful to acknowledge that too, and and that, which is part of what leads him to say that it's not the role of the Church of John to be the head, right? Because it can't be, essentially because of the fact that it would leave like the ordinary Christian, which he clearly values, and explicitly says so in the text. It would kind of leave them like out in the cold. But what I'm talking about, what I'm talking about is that to be the case forever? Because to me, like, love is the legitimate source of authority, right? So it's always like the number one example we always go to when trying to understand like the proper roots of like rightful authority are parents. It's always like parental authority that we acknowledge, and we call the Pope Holy Father. So it's but parental authority is supposed to be based on love, and if it's not, you're a failed parent.
If it's based on the belt, then yeah, it's. I mean, I knew the belt pretty well, but I was still very loved.
Right. I mean, yeah. I mean, I'm not demanding perfection, but it's like,
Yeah.
But if there's like, if it ceases to be based in love, then the authority can be genuinely questioned. And that's the only proper hierarchy. So this is where it's like there is a hierarchy. The hierarchy is a hierarchy of love, not one of power.
Well, then it's
because love is
in a
really
sense.
the true power
And that's why the
in the
heart carries
cosmos.
the head, right?
What was that?
That's why the heart carries the head.
Right. Ultimately.
Yeah.
Yeah, the head is the scholastic tradition.
Yes. That's
Yeah.
what it is. That's what it represents.
Yeah.
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 I think the heart can also remember, like, I think like within the heart, that Church of John that kind of occupies the heart of Christianity is the memory, the collective memory of where we've come from and the things that maybe we've lost along the way that we can also return to and recover. You know, where in that headspace where you're just trying to look at things rationally, dealing with the world that's as it's right in front of you, is sometimes you don't slip into that world of kind of the memory of like what the great points within the Christian history and tradition are that we sometimes we just lose it along the way, but the heart is the one that brings that back to the church and says, these are important parts of who we are. This is an important part of the life that we share across time.
Well, actually, what he says, it's like the communal soul.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I actually think that if as a hermeticist, if that is how he's traveling, his heart carries his head, right? Then that would be the reason why he balked at Vatican II.
Right.
Because it doesn't mean he changed his mind about anything, really. I mean, I don't know anything about Vatican II, so I don't know what he was balking at, but obviously,
well, I think
the heart disagreed with him on that, right? It agreed with what was happening, and because his heart carried his head, he could actually stop and say, and it wasn't. I'm just guessing here. I'm just throwing this out, but it may not have been, a decision to, how do I say this? Destroy a hierarchy of any sort, right? But simply to redirect the attention back to the heart, because anyway, I lost my train of thought.
I think people that are against Catholics who hate Vatican II, I think it is like they see it as a parental betrayal of the children, to go back to the analogy I was using earlier. So it's a failure in love, right? It's like the historic liturgy that was beloved by traditional Catholics was just ripped out from under them without their buy-in from above.
And replaced with an infomercial for Jesus.
Right. Yeah.
That's one ugly piece of liturgy.
Right. And that's really at the core of it. Like all the other issues are really secondary. It is really primarily about the liturgy.
Well, and that's something I can sympathize with it among the traditionalists, because I'm definitely not a traditionalist. I mean, even as somebody who loves the tradition, I'm not a traditionalist. I'm much more experimental. But when it's the words that we've been saying that my grandfather said, that my grandfather's grandfather said, and there's a continuity of life, of a shared life that is embodied in the liturgy, and a shared sense of worship. And I think that there is, even as somebody who's not a traditionalist, I can appreciate that very much. And I think the loss of that would be a tragedy.
You probably
That
see, I mean, a lot of tradies are really attracted to Tomberg, as well as a lot of perennialists.
Yep.
Yeah.
But I think, and I don't, I can, like you, Jack, I can appreciate what's going on up there, but I don't want to be part of it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
it gets too weird. It gets too weird for me. But
Yeah, it gets very weird.
what I think he's proposing, or his suspicion of Vatican II, for instance, I think we could call him a kind of true conservative in a Roger Scruton kind of way.
Yeah.
Kind of, you can almost call him a preservative. He wants to preserve what's good about the past and not throw it out. I mean, I think he would have been disturbed to see over the last couple of years all the statues of everybody coming down, of Flannery Hall at Fordham having its name changed. It was named after Flannery O'Connor, right? So in a fit of wokeness, they tore that name off the building.
Terrible.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too. It's interesting that you bring that up. I on my website, I'd written an article on just like this kind of contemporary iconoclasm that we're in the middle of,
Yep.
right? And it happened in the Reformation too, right? When the old narratives and the old myths no longer hold true, we tear them down. Right. And so like in an American context, like with the tearing down of the statues, of Confederate Civil War veterans and leaders and all that kind of stuff, and is, to me, it's almost an inevitability, is that we no longer believe in this story anymore. These are no longer our heroes. The gods have fallen, in a sense.
Yeah, it's a war of the gods, ultimately, is what it is.
And I think it's like, but there is that, just like we had in modernity and that move into Protestantism, is that iconoclasm was just the replacement of the old gods with the new. And I think that is going to continue. But that's where I think like the real conservatism that you're talking about, Michael, like I'm not a conservative, and not really at all, but there is an element of conservatism that I kind of long for, of a meaningful retrieval. Like, what are you bringing from your past that is important, but with the understanding that the arrow of time points forward, right? And I think that's where conservatives and traditionalists can actually have a really a life-giving presence within the church, as opposed to just being preservationists. Is like, no, with respect to the liturgy, no, this is why this is important that we retain this. This is a part of the witness of the church in time, through time, that we shouldn't let go of. I can very much appreciate and sympathize with that. But then the kind of the conservatism that kind of looks at the past through these gilded lenses, like, there is some golden age of Christianity that we need to return to, that never existed. It would never existed. And I think that's the naivete of the conservative, whereas the naivete of the progressive, and this is something that's more of the danger that I have to be aware of, is that that there's just this unbroken progression into the future that you can impose your will upon and change that and shape that into what you want it to be. And kind of the radical progressivism that we're seeing at work in contemporary society is that kind of iconoclastic thing, but it's because we're seeing the breakdown, you could say, within institutional Christianity, but I would just say within the whole concept of what the West is kind of being called into question.
You can't have progress without a telos.
Yeah.
You just simply can't. So that's where progressivism goes astray. I think when it goes astray is it doesn't have a clear notion of anything that can genuinely be considered a telos.
Yeah, and telos like implies a certain continuity with the past as well.
Correct. Which is, I think, like, I don't know if you read David's new book yet, Jed?
Tradition and Apocalypse.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. So that's, I mean, obviously that's kind of what he's driving at there, is like using this idea of a final cause to help understand tradition in a more meaningful way. But
yeah, like there's a future orientation, the future orientation of tradition itself.
Correct.
The apocalyptic orientation of a tradition that is still revealing something.
But you keep it in balance by having an eye toward like the genuine telos of tradition, which David posits in that book is the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
So I have a question about all of this. I'm just listening because I really don't know much about it, but it feels to me like the rose-colored glasses are there's a vision of utopia behind them, right? Whether it's from the past or into the future. And there is no such thing as utopia.
Well, no, the kingdom of God is the utopian vision. Let's not, there's no getting around that.
That's
Well,
the present.
Bulgakov has got a really interesting critique when he critiques communism, right? And the kind of the utopianism of Marxism in some of his essays there in Sociology of Death, right? He's keenly aware that there's no real humanistic way to achieve a utopia, and Hart brings that out in Tradition and Apocalypse, like the future orientation, the Christian utopia is the kingdom. And
depends on how you want to understand human. I mean,
yeah, I mean, but I'm saying like in the sense of like in the modernist sense of like,
right,
you know, the Enlightenment kind of, you know,
I would be with you on that. I just want to say there's
yeah.
like a Christian humanism that is
Yeah,
related to
really
Christology
good.
that we would
Yeah.
absolutely want to affirm.
Yeah.
So yeah, okay. Just really quick, I want to the idea of the iconoclasm discussion, and this kind of like, you know, war of the gods or trying to replace the old gods with the new. I would like to talk about that in light of what Tomberg says in this chapter about symbols, because he talks about the two different types of symbols. He talks about the typological symbols, which he says that the major arcana are typological symbols, and then he says that the other type of symbols are mythological symbols, and the typological symbols are related to above below correspondences, and the mythological symbols are related to time. So like they kind of form a cross. There's
Space and time.
yeah, space and time. And to me, that seems to be related to what's going on with these iconoclastic struggles,
Yes.
because they're definitely, it's like the powers above are influencing what's going on below, and there's a war in the heavens, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Yeah.
I keep thinking about ancestor. I mean, you can call it worship. I don't think it is really, but that kind of like in First Nations and in Eastern religion, there's this keeping alive of the memory, and not just keeping it alive, but there's a deep honoring and respect for the ancestor. I can speak mostly about First Nations because I know the culture, and they practice it with elders who are living, right? And then the stories that they tell, the sacred stories, are from elders from the past. And it is a form of iconicity, because the person is the image, right? In First Nation culture. So the elder is the image, the ancestor is the image, and they carry the story forward. And I think that when images are destroyed, I think it's a devastation to our ancestors. I think that's what it is. Like on a more metaphysical plane, it's like a denial of their wisdom and what they brought, because we are our ancestors, whether we like it or not.
And I don't think it's remotely accidental that this is going on at the same time that we have this growing aspiration towards transhumanism. I think there's a direct connection to that, because ultimately
because
all the past is what we want to destroy in this moment, or that those who are destroying the entire past. Now, can you think of any time in human history before modernity where there was as little regard for the past?
It's almost like there's an amnesia, but I think so. I'll offer a little bit of a challenge here, because I'm somewhat sympathetic with the iconoclasts here, right? I don't think, you know, I might be like a moderating position within iconoclasm. Is when we no longer believe in the gods, we tear down their temples, right? And I think that like in a sense, like putting this more in the realm of American civic religion and our American culture and context, right? Like a statue of like Robert E. Lee, right? That there was a symbolic meaning to that America could be this forgiving, embracing nation and see the value in even somebody who had fought against her, right? And that there was a certain dignity, there was a certain continuity of,
Well, it's
like,
the
let's say,
he
Southern
represents
culture.
the noble adversary too, which is
The noble,
which is an old archetype. I mean,
yeah,
that's what
yeah,
Hector is in the Iliad. It's the
yeah,
noble adversary.
and Hector is truly the hero of the
Right.
Iliad, right?
Right. And Robert E. Lee was seen by both sides as like an exemplar of the best traits. Like it
right,
was universally agreed. There was no
and
dispute about this.
I think our tendency in American culture is to go straight to the image, but like what's layered underneath that, if you're, like if you're an African American, like if you're seeing that, you're seeing that through a very different lens. You're seeing that as a indicative and embodying a system that didn't really work for you, right? If you broaden that out into some of the bigger iconoclastic questions, I think it's that the current generation of younger Americans no longer believe in the American myth.
Well, I
So
think
there's no reason to put any stock into these old gods, because these old gods are not propitious, right? I'm no longer deriving benefit from this narrative of like the American dream that's been sold to me. So I think there's just, it's kind of this
But how
foment
do
of
you know
rage.
that? How do you know
Yeah.
that? If how do you know that when you've been raised in an age that essentially just doesn't look at the past as anything that has anything of value? So you
Yeah,
already
so I
have
think
this,
yeah,
you've already been reared in this environment that gives you this bias toward thinking that everything old is outdated and worthless and can be discarded because history is just this line of progress.
yeah, and to me, like the reason why I would like not be like I'm concerned about the iconoclasm is the erasure of our past, even like the ugliness of the past. We have to remember that part of ourselves, like in how conflicted those symbols actually are. And so there is a sense where, for me, like that is the concern with the iconoclasm. But we already are raised with a cultural and historical amnesia as Americans. We're a future-oriented nation, almost exclusively. The past has no meaning to us. That's what we left
But
behind.
you're right that we have to be able to acknowledge these imperfect elements. I was listening to an interview with Alexander Dugan the other day, and he was saying something about he was talking to Michael Millerman, and he was talking about his interest in Greek drama of late, and he was talking about how the Greek drama, the ancient Greek tragedy, kind of it shows this tension of the divine human, and that tragic backstory, that tragic element is part of that process that is leading toward our theosis.
Well, he talks about it in terms of loving your enemies, right? Of learning, like reconciliation, actually.
Right.
That and this is the thing that I was thinking. Like, I think that iconoclasm happens when people lose iconic vision, when they don't see the symbolic anymore, right? When they live in a flat, one-dimensional world, and then all of a sudden it only represents the one thing. And it also alleviates pain and suffering because they don't have to wrestle with the image. And well, that's where we grow in the wrestling and in the pain and suffering of that, right? I think. So, yeah.
It's interesting you mentioning, I had to look it up. Thank goodness I have a digital copy of this book. But one of the things he says on page 292, he said, now the Hermeticist is essentially an iconophile. And symbols are not obstacles that must be eliminated in order to arrive at knowledge of the truth, but rather means for receiving revelation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So,
and that's a sociological statement for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Well, I
that
think
revelation might be painful, right? And then you have to contend with it. And that is what the thorns are, right?
Like
When Adam and Eve.
there's good and there's evil in that image,
Yeah,
but if you erase it, you don't see it.
right. Exactly.
But then you can get a comfort animal, so that'll be
Well,
okay.
That's what
think also,
that's actually what I was thinking about.
Sherry, I was going to bounce this off of you because you were kind of, as we're discussing iconoclasm, like the thought occurs to me, like with respect to iconic vision, right? And it's kind of a term we throw around in these parts quite a bit lately, and I really love it. Is I think that what excites, I see the iconoclastic movement is just a historical inevitability. I mean, if you put some Hegelian analysis into what's going on, it's of course it's happening.
Yeah.
There's no way it wasn't going to happen. It was almost like there was an inevitability to the moment we live in, that maybe there's ways it can look different and be shaped different. But what it does to me is it opens up the space for a new and fresh iconic vision to bring to bear that old symbolic and iconic lexicon.
Sun, Jed.
What's that? But it's kind of in like that sense of like in Eliot at the very end of Four Quartets, is to return to a place and to know it again for the first time. Like there's you go through this period of blindness and the eyes open again and you can see what you've been looking at the whole time, but through a different set of eyes from a different set of vision. And so the kind of the crumbling of the old order as we're watching that happen is it does open up the ability to bring to bear a new vision for the future, but that does retain its teleological orientation and continuity with the past.
Right.
And saying, well, we don't have to tear down our temples and cast down our gods. Is we need to understand them and look at them in a different light. And
well, that to me, that's transformation. That's the difference between destruction and transformation, right? The thing that transforms doesn't actually lose its shape.
Yeah.
It has a shape, right? And like the caterpillar, for example, becoming the butterfly, that's the easiest one, right? And it has a shape and it retains the shape, but it transforms itself. And yeah, that's it. That's all I got.
But also I can't remember where he gets into it, but there's this, I mean, an icon can become an idol, right?
Yes.
Yes.
So, and that's what Eliot's getting at too, right? At the end of Four Quartets is how, and this is something that I think Tomberg talks about from Revelation, how to make all things new, right? That's kind of the task of Christian Hermeticism, is to not get stuck. It's an interesting thing. How do you retain this kind of appreciation for posterity, not turn it into an idol? Like one of the things that drives me insane are, all the Christian classical schools, right? Let's make Catholicism great again.
I went to one. I went to Thomas Aquinas College.
There's nothing wrong. I mean, I really think. I'm a guy. It pains me that students can graduate with an English degree and not have read Shakespeare, or don't know anything about mythology. Yeah. Or haven't ever read Homer. Yeah. Or because there's so much, and it's not idolatry. I mean, I just read about the Iliad last week. It's the farthest thing from idolatry. It deconstructs its own myth. But it's painful for that to see people rejecting that. And the task, I think, before all of us, and particularly if we want to see Christianity survive, is how to make it new. And that doesn't right the old either, right? How to make the old new as well.
Right. Did you see that recent conversation? I think it was David Armstrong and David Bentley Hart on Japanese aesthetics. Did you happen to catch that online at all? It was a really interesting discussion, and I had been kind of studying some of that with respect to like the kind of the wabi-sabi concept of kintsugi, right? That this broken vessel is then put back together with like this golden enamel and becomes something new, right?
See, that's the
Is
thing.
that
So that's the
the
same thing that,
appreciation, the
yeah, that's
appreciation of like there is a place where even the old can be new,
right.
right? The old can be reappropriated in new ways, and it can exceed itself in that transformation of the opening up of that old icon into a new set of layers of meaning and possibilities. When the icon opens up you to the world of possibility, it's doing its job. But when an icon becomes something that locks you back into the past, it has become the idol, right? And so I think that's the space of that's the exciting part of the time this turbulent time we live in, is that we can bring like major arcana or Christian iconography or anything in that realm of that symbolic order, is this reasserting those and saying, no, these actually really have value, and they're not just about our past, but they're telling us something about our present and opening up the possibility for a different future.
I've had this discussion with Shari before, but to me, the difference between an icon and an idol really has to do with the mode of attention. And if you're simply, if you're looking at something as opposed to looking through something, that's going to make it an idol
That's
instead of an icon.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually, we were radically enough suggesting that, like, because it is a mode of attention, that even something that is literally a pagan idol, if it is engaged with in the proper way, with the proper mode of attention, can actually function as an icon.
Yeah.
So that, like, an ancient Scandinavians like carved idol of Thor, if the proper mode of attention is given to it, can actually function genuinely as an icon.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm in the middle of like slowly working my way through the Bhagavad Gita for the first time, right? And kind of encountering Shiva, right? And it's been an interesting thing because I'm trying to read this in a sense as an act of Christian devotion, right? And so I'm reading it in a sense, maybe in a little bit of an unorthodox way, but as a Christian text, right? And then what is this telling me? What is this telling me about reality? And so it's very interesting because then, Shiva is not the idol to be torn down, but the it's the reorientation, the proper orientation of the relationship that we have with the gods. Right. Is that I have something to learn, but also there's something in the act of being the human in that iconographic sense that Christ teaches us, is that we have something for the gods. Like we have something for them. They're learning in and through us in a way that, so I find that those things that used to be threatening, when you hit that transformative moment, they are no longer threatening. They become an ally in the spiritual
that's that
journey.
common soul that Tomberg talks about in this chapter. There's definitely a strong perennialist element, as Michael indicated earlier,
Mm-hmm.
that underlies what he's doing here. And yet at the same time, it's also quite explicitly Christian. And I don't think those things are contradictory at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think it's Christianity that I don't think perennialism can be thought in a universe where Christianity doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
So can we talk about this image? Because he says on page 17, he says, all conclusions of a metaphysical nature are based only on the analogy of man. And I mean, I'm just going through like a phase right now where this is super salient to me.
Right. Well, the analogies part is like one of the most powerful things in the chapter. I'm glad we were finally getting around to talking about that.
Yeah, because
go for it, Shari.
He's got this quote here, and it thus appears that the entire world is like a single mirror full of lights presenting the divine wisdom, or as charcoal emitting light, from Bonaventura. And I mean, I love George MacDonald. I read him, and I'm listening to Fantastes now for the second time, and I just finished The Wise Woman, and the mirror just constantly appears, right? And then there's that beautiful introduction to The Signature of All Things by Boehme, where he says that man is the memorandum opus Dei, the masterpiece of God, right? The hieroglyphic of eternity and time. And in the third chapter of Fantastes, and I'm just throwing this all out here just for the sake of conversation, he starts it with a poem. Man doth usurp all space, stares thee in rock, bush, river in the face. Never thine eyes behold a tree, 'tis no sea thou seest in the sea. 'Tis but a disguised humanity. To avoid thy fellow, vain thy plan. All that interests a man is man. That's by Henry Sutton. And I'm just going to lay this on my cards on the table. So there's this hiddenness of God in the world, right? And I think it's hidden in plain sight. It's the image of a man. That is the hiddenness of God to me in the world. And George MacDonald talks about nature as being, the wardrobe with which we clothe our thoughts, right? That everything that happens inside of us is the world is man turned inside out, he says, so that we can do this mirror thing, right? We're reflecting on it, and we're using the terminology from what we see, from the representations, as Barfield would say. We're using that to describe our inner life, right? And I know I'm walking on a really sharp edge, but we are made in the image of God. And so there's this reciprocity, right? And that's why I think images are so important.
Mm-hmm.
Because it doesn't matter what they are an image of, they are going to talk, like Henry Sutton says, all that interests a man is man, right? And so it's because of the image of God, the hiddenness of God, right?
Yeah.
In us.
Irenaeus talks about that as the glory of God is the human being, right? Is the glory of God is the image.
Right, but
man.
you make this journey, and that I think this is exactly what the magician is talking about, is that you make this journey into yourself, right? And that's what makes all the work play, because it opens the world up again, right? And then you can hold everything on your fingertips, because suddenly the world is iconic, right? And it's talking to you about you, but when it talks to you about you, it talks to you about God at the same time, because you are the image of God.
Right. And I think Sophia is the mirror.
Yeah, wait till you get to the High Priestess chapter, Shari. The mirror
I've been
shows up
reading
in
it.
a big way.
Oh,
yeah.
okay. I haven't got there yet, but that's something I've intuited a long time ago. Like the mirror imagery is definitely it's so deeply, the mirror is so deeply connected to the idea of the divine feminine that it's just obvious to me that the mirror has to be associated with Sophia.
Yeah. So I have some thoughts, Shari, but I'm interested to hear, like, with what you're talking about is how Michael, how might you bring a sociological perspective to bear on the, I totally tracking with you, Shari. I love exactly where you're going with that. And I'm interested to hear, Michael, just in terms of as a sociologist and somebody who's been steeped in that for basically your career, is how does sociology come to bear in this question that Shari's asking?
That is sociology.
That is sociology. That's what I was going to say.
That was a perfect expression of it. She nailed it.
I mean, that's what it is.
That is it. Because, and this is where, when he says it's the art of learning, this concentration without effort, this gazing, right? And we talked about this with Wayne, right? That in that verse, right? There's a progression there where you gaze and you contemplate and you walk and then you're at the mirror. Right?
Well, yeah. The thing is, there's theoretical sociology, which is okay, but there's practical sociology, and which is what this is, right? And and this is why you see so many sociological insights in Henry Vaughan in particular, the metaphysical poet. I mean, he's just incredibly sociological. People have been trying to interpret him as a kind of a proto-romantic, and I guess you can see that. But the thing is, he was in a totally different cultural context. He was actually trying to preserve that Christian vision of the macrocosm and its relationship to the microcosm, and the notion that divinity speaks to us through the things of this world, or like one of my favorite poems by Richard Wilbur, love calls us to the things of this world, right?
Yes.
And it's really what it is. That's the essence of it. And and that's why I shouldn't say patience, but I'm not too interested in a purely theoretical sociology. It's really just another changeable philosophy amongst other philosophies or ways of interpreting the world, because it doesn't mean anything if it's not practical, if it's not something that can be lived. And George MacDonald is a great example of someone who illustrates how that actually works. Novalis is another, Henry Vaughan's another. I mean, certainly through poets.
Yeah, I have this George MacDonald little bit from The Wise Woman, that because to me this is what you're talking about laying sociology out in a theoretical way. It's a form of possession, right? And I just love this. It's a conversation between the wise woman who's disguised as a beautiful child, right, and Rosamond.
Sophia. Let's just call her Sophia.
Yeah. And so it goes, won't you give me a little flower, please, you beautiful child? There they are. They are all for you, answered the child, pointing with her outstretched arm and forefinger all round. But you told me a minute ago not to touch them. Yes, indeed I did. But they can't be mine if I'm not to touch them. If to call them yours, you must kill them. Then they are not yours and never can be yours. They are nobody's when they are dead. But you didn't kill them. I don't pull them. I throw them away. I live them. How is it that you make them grow? I say, you darling, and throw it away, and there it is. Where do you get them? In my lap. I wish you would let me throw one away. Have you got any in your lap? Let me see. No, I have none. Then you can't throw one away if you haven't got one. To me, that little conversation, it's everything. Everything is contained in that conversation.
Shari, one of the things that kind of, to back into the question, and I think it connects to the McDonald quote in a way, but the question you had asked earlier about kind of this image-based question, the thing that came to mind immediately was Berjayev, like that little volume, Creativity Will Save the World, which is just kind of a compendium of some of his essays, but where he discusses kind of I think it's the anthroposophical concept of the Third Testament, right? What is this revelation that is coming into the world? And I think it's actually a very Pauline thought, is the revelation of us, of the people. Like, it's we're not waiting for a new book to come along. We're waiting for the actual calling forth of the people of God as into what their actual identity is. And I think so I think that one of the driving questions of our age is actually theosis. And that connects to the great danger of our age, which is transhumanism, which is not possible. You can never transition out of humanity, like technologically or otherwise. You're always human. It may take a different shape or form, but is I think that the false offer of transhumanism and the kind of the virtual world that we're trying to get pushed into it's a self-directed, egotistical theosis that cannot accept the one necessary ingredient to theosis, which is death.
Right.
And the only way that we transcend is through the embracing of that. And so I think
that throwing away that Shari talks about.
Yeah. And so the relationship really is the opportunity to image forth that in express theosis is expressed for the Christian in kenosis, right? In the emptying, the self-emptying, and the love for the neighbor. And I think that's the great challenge in our time, is that what does it mean, not just to be human, but to be divine? Because we're getting to a place technologically where we're achieving things that were once, the territory of the gods, right?
Right.
If I showed up in the 16th century with this, I could have probably got burnt at the stake. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
Or
yeah, I got this little
elevated
magic box that gives me all the answers, right?
Yeah.
Well, so like we're doing things that wizards do.
Yeah. We have power and no wisdom.
Yeah, and what is that doing to us? Well, it's effacing that image that is meant to rise up and to be revealed. And I think that like in terms of like the sociology that informs that, Michael, is like what you're saying is it's an integrated spirituality that brings heaven down to earth where your feet hit the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah, but do you understand though the importance of images in the sense that they are part of this art of learning? Like you
Yeah.
cannot contemplate without. That's why we live in a world, right? That's why there are trees and forests and fish and birds and grass and flowers, and because they are the image.
It's
And we have
actually,
to. And so in order to see this image, which is the hiddenness of God in the world, you have to look at images, right?
And when you
have
can
to
begin to see
contend.
that, yeah. And when you begin to see that, then you become, that is the revelation. That is we are God revealed in the world. When you can see God in the world, you can also image God forth into the world. When you see God in nature, or in your neighbor, or wherever it is that you're encountering God, when you are recognizing the Sophianic
happens
presence
is
of God, you are also
through the
bringing that to
mirror
bear.
when that
Yeah.
happens.
which
Yeah.
brings
Through the
us
mirror,
back.
you're in the enchanted world, and you are being transformed, and you don't even know it. See, this is the
All of Thomas Traherne's poetry is about exactly this right here.
Right.
is
How
it?
to enter into the kingdom by a change of disposition, by becoming a child,
Yes.
right? You'll never enter the kingdom of heaven unless you become like a little child. And that's what George
Yeah.
MacDonald was doing, right?
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Which brings us back to the idea of play earlier, which was part of like, the image of the magician, the turning work into play. That's connected with the child. And then when you were something, you made me think of the part where he talks about Schiller's idea of the Spieltrieb. You can correct my
Yeah.
German pronunciation, Shari, if you want. But where like essentially where you have like a recognition, like a correspondence of the beautiful and the true, which is essentially what accomplishes that. Which I think is what you were talking about, Shari, because it's like you have to see that correspondence.
Well, then everything is beautiful and true, right? That's enchantment.
Right.
Well, so that's kind of a fun thing. Like, I think to maybe look at, even to reframe like some of like the more cerebral activity, like theology and biblical interpretation and all these kinds of things. Like Robert Capon is a guy that I really enjoy. His work on the parables is great, but he says from the outset in that book, Kingdom, Judgment, Grace, that his whole approach to the text is this approach of playfulness, and his interpretations are so fresh. He's seeing things that are absolutely in Jesus's parables in his books, but it's coming from this spirit of playfulness and a spirit of discovery versus like rational enclosure and possession, right? When you're playing, you're just having a good time, right? And I think that spirit of play is there's a liberation when it's like no longer am I studying this author because I'm trying to figure it out, but because this author is a play partner. This is somebody I'm playing with, whether that's on the
And what activity could be more appropriate for children of God than play?
Douglas Harding in that 4 Stages of Life, he talks about showing a small child, like a toddler-sized child, himself in the mirror and saying, "This is you," and the child goes, "Okay." And he goes outside and he's everything. He's the grass, he's the trees, he's the sky, he's a bird, he's Superman. He can be everything. all at once, right?
Right.
And he doesn't see himself as himself. And of course, the sage, to Harding, is the person who returns to that state of childlikeness. And I think that
But without being childish. So the
Right,
sage
that's
is actually in a better
the
state than
mirror.
the child.
right.
Yeah.
Because he talks about teenagerhood as being confronted with that image in the mirror and then being terrified of it, right? Because suddenly you realize that is you, and infinity, or whatever, however you want to call it, you know, the world, the cosmos disappears, and it's just you, right?
Right.
And then he describes how, you know, it's no wonder that teenagers are angry and, you know, disillusioned and so on, right? But the sage, and I mean, this correlates perfectly to Barfield when he talks about original participation, withdrawal, and final participation, right? It's the same process. And that's also Sophia, right? Like that's moving into enchantment. It's all those things, I think.
Well, participation, I think, I mean, we ultimately end up bringing Barfield into every conversation, but I think like participation, Barfield's idea of participation is a sociological concept ultimately.
I think you see that in certain elements. Like, I mean, you see how age some are definitely ruined in age, but those who have managed, I guess, to live a life, live the good life in some way, like you see that in like our elderly population, where there's a playfulness among the elderly. They've returned to their,
the old people you actually want to hang out with.
Yeah, the ones that like, like I was just at, you know, like a little donut shop picking up some donuts for my employees, and it was a bunch of 90-year-old dudes hanging out and just like cutting it up. And so I stayed for a half an hour just talking with these guys, and they're hilarious. And it's just like the playfulness, and like it's almost like they're back at that kind of adolescent, you know, that age of like 8 to about 13, where the kids are so interesting, and like everything is just this state of play, and it is really it's a beautiful thing.
So you're making me want to tell a story about my grandfather now. So my grandfather, he was a chef. And he had like he was not, I mean, he had like only an 8th grade education. No, actually, I guess he did go to high school, because he played high school basketball in Arkansas before moving back to Oklahoma. But in any case, he got dementia. We don't know if it was Alzheimer's. We never had an autopsy done to determine, but he had advanced dementia. And he got to the point where he didn't recognize anybody. And this is like, I mean, this is very hard on the family, but when we went to visit him, like, he was so joyful and happy and enjoying his life still, even though he was experiencing this extreme dementia. He always had a smile on his face. He would delight. Like, I brought my my girlfriend and her young daughter to visit him. And she had a daughter from a previous marriage who was like really little toddler. And my grandfather was just so in 7th heaven being able to watch that little girl run around and play. And he was just full of joy. And there was this, on the same ward with him, there was this retired nun who was just so bitter and angry all the time, constantly. And she was just miserable. And it was just like unbelievable to see that contrast. So it's definitely, you definitely see it in some of our elders, but in some of our elders become very, very bitter and angry and isolated. So, and I really think that what makes the difference is, I think it's something that's operating at a spiritual level, because my grandfather, it's like, he wasn't churched and he wasn't educated, but he was just he's the best man I've ever known, to be honest with you. Like, I've never known a man who was better than my grandfather. He had the biggest heart. And he was just very genuine and authentic. So, yeah.
Thoughts, Michael?
Oh, well, you guys kept making me think about.
I know, I saw you going for a book.
And it was right in front of me. I'm looking all over the room. It's right in front of me. Here's just a stanza from Thomas Traherne's poem Wonder, which is his most famous. Well, I'll just read the first stanza. How like an angel came I down, how bright are all things here. When first among his works I did appear, oh how their glory did me crown. The world resembled his eternity in which my soul did walk, and everything that I did see did with me talk. And
Yeah.
all of his poetry, his meditation are just theme and variation on how we enter the kingdom.
Right.
Yep.
Children.
Well, this is, I'm
Well,
listening to
that's our Edenic state ultimately.
Okay.
Like that's it.
Like Edith Stein, for instance, writes about this, and he's saying, you know, our relationship to God is, you know, she gives the analogy: if your mother is holding you as an infant, you're never worried that she's going to drop you.
Right.
That should be our relationship to God, she says.
Yeah.
Drop you.
That's great.
Well, what's interesting about that too, Michael, and I think this is definitely something. Yeah, I'm not educated, in literature, but I love poetry very much, and what I find is that I find the poets to be far more trustworthy than the theologians.
So do I.
Well, and liturgies and prayers too.
Yeah,
Like there's something about them where they just like magically preserve things that the church can forget, but they're these buried nuggets.
Yeah, next time statement, right?
So
There's
yeah, and I think that's where it's like to bring those things out, though, to bring out Traherne or Coleridge or any of the great poets, all the way up into I really love Liesl Mueller. I don't think she was a Christian poet by any means, but there's something in her work that I feel like the opportunity, and it's like that creativity, the expression of the image is what needs to come out, and it's like that doesn't come through like the rational field of apperception. There's a much more affective domain that has to come to bear, like the seeing, the calling forth and imaging of beauty, and of goodness and those kinds of things. And what theology does really good is it talks about those things, but it doesn't enter into and participate in that thing.
Yeah.
And poetry is the participative. It's participatory. It's already in it. It's expressing what's there.
Now, there used to be substantial critical literature about that from the early 20th century. And Evelyn Underhill, in her famous work, Mysticism, she touches on it quite a bit in there. Should we consider poets mystics, right? And,
right.
Yeah.
Well, they are sociologists, in my opinion.
Well, and you see that, and back into Four Quartets is like, Eliot's struggle of like this desire to be the mystic and to be the saint, but this realization that he is the poet. Right.
Speaking,
And
I just have to mention this really quickly. Sorry, Joe, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah. No problem.
But Shari and I had a conversation with Yosef recently, and I don't think we recorded this part of the conversation, but we were talking about scripture, and I was talking about like how a large chunk of the Bible is poetry, and Yosef was sharing with us that there's actually a significant rabbinical tradition that regards the entire Bible as poetry. Not even the books that we all universally acknowledge as being, like everyone obviously acknowledges that the Psalms are poetry.
And I said to him, "You mean the book of Leviticus?" And he goes, "Especially
Leviticus," which I actually know, and that's actually what's funny. I actually noticed it in Leviticus when when my little local church Bible study, we've been studying Leviticus for a while now, and I actually brought up in our Bible study, it's like, this seems like it has a poetic structure to me, because there are all these like sort of like chanty repeated phrases that are always said in exactly the same way throughout the text. And also, I mean, if you think about the way that these books are like read within the context of a Jewish service, they're chanted. And there's a specific way in which they're supposed to be chanted. So it tells you it's poetry.
Well, in a sense, like those legal texts are so interesting. And I see the poetry in them exactly kind of like what Yosef is like pointing out is what it is, if you are able to do a good layered reading of Leviticus, what is giving you is the picture of the world that they lived in, and in the kind of the world as a sacred order. And here's how it is held together through these rites and rituals and laws and regulations. Is it was all about a cosmology that had God at the heart of all of it.
Yeah,
And
like
so,
literally at the center of everything.
yeah, and the Holy of Holies, and so that's, there is a poetry even to the scriptures that is, it's a deep one, and I think that it's that poetic sense and that artistic sense and that creative sense is what is really needed. And that is that's a Sophianic thing that arises from the sense of God in all things.
Right.
And the sense of God in that Sophianic sense of embrace of that's the her side of things. It's like she is calling out to us.
Right.
And trying to call something out of us.
And there's something about Michael's resistance to like a sort of systematizing of that too, because it is, as you correctly point out, it is associated with this feminine aspect of God. And there's something about that where you just lose something when you try to make it explicit.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to read, because I read that Sutton poem, and that's at the beginning of the 3rd chapter of Phantastes. And then 2 chapters later, he says this: all this time as I went through the wood, I was haunted with the feeling that other shapes, more like my own size and mien, were moving about at a little distance on all sides of me. But as yet, I could discern none of them, although the moon was high enough to send a great many of her rays down between the trees. And these rays were unusually bright and sight-giving, notwithstanding she was only a half moon. And I know the moon, I don't really understand all the symbolism of the moon in his writings, but it has a place. I constantly imagined, however, that forms were visible in all directions except that to which my gaze was turned, and that they only became invisible or resolved themselves into other woodland shapes the moment my looks were directed towards them. So as soon as he looked straight at something, it lost its human shape. However, this may have been, except for the feeling of presence, the wood seemed utterly bare of anything like human companionship. Although my gaze often fell on some object which I fancied to be a human form, for I soon found that I was quite deceived, as the moment I fixed my regard on it, it showed plainly that it was a bush or a tree or a rock, which is like a perfect reference back to that Sutton poem, right? And what he's saying here is that he sees the forms in his peripheral vision, but when he fixes his gaze on them, they've just become a bush or a tree or a rock, right?
I read something years ago, Shari, about exactly that Aboriginal peoples rely more on their peripheral vision than their foveal vision like Western people do, which is why they see more fairies.
Exactly. And my sister,
time for your look around story.
Yeah, I know. My sister tells the story of Look Around. I think I mentioned it in our last talk that we had, but I was telling her one day that I said to her, you know what, I stole your story and I tell it all the time because of the idea of peripheral vision. And she said, well, there's another element to that, because she's a wellness coach at the band office where she lives, and she went to a workshop, and they were talking about how to reduce stress. And so if you sit for 3 seconds and focus on your peripheral vision, just try to see what's in your peripheral vision, you activate your pineal gland, which is third eye.
Right.
Yeah,
right?
It's interesting. It's
very
really interesting.
Very interesting.
What it kind of brings into sense is like the like when you're saying peripheral vision, I'm thinking in terms of like, so when I write fiction, like the concepts of panorama and like depth of field, when you're cultivating a setting, right? The setting is the living place where the character's story unfolds, right? And so to be attuned to the setting, where am I? And where is this thing taking place? And I love it, like to drive up the stretch of Highway 395 that goes through the Mojave Desert along the eastern edge of the Sierras. And so you get these huge sprawling panoramas of mountains and desert, and just it's just really, it's like important topography of my own soul, right, is when we in the West, we have that focused vision, right? That the optics, you can focus on an object, but we tend to objectify, right? That is the idolatrous move of the West, is this objectification of reality. So it's no longer a subject, we lose subjectivity in that. But then that panoramic and the peripheral vision, you see yourself as the subject within a setting, within a place. And that it's not just the relationship between me and object A and object B, but in a constellation of relationships that being that panoramic vision allows us to have. And I think it's where we really struggle, is to just, in a sense, to see the big picture, right? Nobody's stepping back and saying, like, what is the big picture telling me about where we're at in reality right now and what our relationship to it is.
Right. It
I don't
reminds
know.
me
That's just
of,
a thought.
no, that's great, because that reminds me of the part of the text where Tomberg's actually talking about like how the magician, one of the things that the magician is about is this union of conscious and unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, like, the ghost of Ian McGilchrist is haunting that a little bit too, because which relates to this whole idea of peripheral vision and our tendency toward this narrow focus, objective kind of vision within Western culture, which I think McGilchrist rightly sees as endangering us in the long run. Which brings us back to the ecological ramifications of sociology and all kinds of other things. So that's a really rich area of thought.
What's interesting, like my sister was saying about the workshop, was that it's a part of healing trauma, is that exercise, is to heal trauma.
Right.
And I mean, we are traumatized by the world, right? And so, and then, you know, this gets it's too many things for me to talk about, but it gets back to the images again, you know, because that's what you see, right? Like George MacDonald's description of these forms, right? These shapes, and that somehow they seem human, but when he looks directly at them, then they're not, right? And what's happening to Anodos? Pardon?
Yeah, he anticipated the Heisenberg principle, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's kind of interesting. That is even the apocalyptic formulary of "I looked and I saw," right? And that it pulls off of the negative image in early in Isaiah of seeing they do not see, hearing they do not hear, is like the apocalyptic act is to see what is in front of you. What is in front of you has become then an act of revelation where you can actually see. Right. So that, you know, to look and see, because we're looking all the time, but we're not seeing. Obviously something's not registering.
Which suggests that the world that we experience as trauma is somehow not real.
Yeah, and that's why the tarot is so important, because it's an image.
Mm-hmm.
And it teaches you to see, right? It's you can look at the image, but you have to learn. It's the art of learning to see, which is iconicity, right? Which is iconic vision, and which is why we live in a world of representations, right? Because to find God is to see God. This is what Job says: I have heard of you, but now I see you, right? Now I see you. And how did he see God? He saw God when God said, look at this. You don't get it. That's how he saw God.
Right.
God opened up the whole thing to him and said, you're never going to understand this, Job. Right? But he saw all the images. And then
I think there's a Simon and Garfunkel song about that.
Terrence Malick film about that.
Yeah.
The Tree of Life actually has an epigraph, is that quote from Job.
Is it? I never saw that movie.
Oh,
you'll love it. You'll love it.
Yeah.
That's a really
when I think that there's that interesting thing with like the magician card and like its place at the very front of it, like he talks about how it contains all of the arcana.
Yeah, he calls it the arcanum of the arcana.
and like
Well, it's
in a
a
sense, it's
basis
like
of it. If you don't have that, you don't have all the rest, he says.
like the story of the Arcana is basically how one becomes the magician, and the invitation to become the kind of person that can concentrate without effort and transform work into play. The magician is a youthful figure, which you would think that the magician is this ancient person like the hermit or something like that. But no, the magician has returned to youth. It's at the front of the, is at the front, but is, with that symbol of eternity and
Well,
the
Well,
balance.
he calls it at one point. He said at one point he calls the magician the representation of the spirit man. So
Mhm,
so it's the man that ultimately, from a Christian perspective, that's the man who's united to Christ.
mhm,
Which is why I said that we earlier in the conversation that we need to connect love to this,
mhm,
because it's the kind of knowing that we're talking about is really love.
mhm,
And love is what motivates us to dive into anything with that depth of effort,
mhm.
initial effort that leads to concentration without effort, that turns work into play, that makes every yoke easy and every burden light. So
Yeah, there is that. It's so
So
true, Nate. Like the
here's a
element of
question.
love that makes something like, it's not that love is always easy, but love has the ability to make a hard thing very easy.
yes. So learning to
But
love is learning to know.
Mhm,
like I'm just wondering, we talk about this turning work into play, and basically we're mastering something, right? Concentration without effort. It's a mastery of something. We've compared
I,
it to playing a musical instrument. But is it the work that counts, or is it the time? Like, this is what I'm wondering. Is this a matter of time? I don't
in what
know.
way? In
Of
what?
putting in the appropriate amount of hours.
Huh?
Um,
Yeah.
it takes time, I'd say,
Takes time. Yeah.
but well, and maybe it takes time. Children do it automatically, right?
right.
So it didn't take them any time.
Mhm. That's true.
We went to
That's
school
true.
to ruin that. Yeah.
But then you have to you come back to that later in life, like having lost that childlike sense of play that comes so naturally to the child. But you realize that what is actually happening with the child at play, there's so much more happening there, because you have to go through, if you want to return to that playful state, you have to go through the journey, like the journey of the Arcana, like that has its own hazards, it has its perils. You have to deal with the devil card. You have to deal with those difficult aspects of the life journey. But the return to play is a return to play where you're not just doing it automatically or instinctively, but you're doing it with an understanding of just how, to get to the place of playfulness
Right.
is the journey, is the effort to get there. It shows you all of what is going on when the child, all of that is there when the child is playing. They're just not aware of any of it.
Right.
But
You
like, let's
know,
say like Michael Jordan, when he's playing on the basketball court, like when he's when he's in a state of play, he's doing that with a knowledge of what it takes to get to that level of play, right?
so
Well, I'm thinking about it.
directly related to that. Another story about my grandfather directly related to that. One of the things that my grandfather would do is, even after like I had stopped playing youth baseball, he would always go to all my games, all my practices. He was always super involved. But even after I stopped playing, he would still go to watch youth baseball games, because he just loved the experience of watching young people play just for the love of the game.
Hmm.
Like, he would prefer that to watching a major. I mean, he was a big San Francisco Giants fan because he worked in San Francisco as a chef for like 40 years, so that was his team.
Well, we
And he
can
loved
forgive
Major
him for
League
that.
Baseball, and yeah, he loved Major League Baseball too. But he really, really loved to go to youth baseball games and just sit
Uh-huh.
there and watch.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, so
Yeah.
I was just thinking about that diagram of above and below, and
yeah,
because
above and below, crossing the
there's a
axis of time,
there's this point of convergence,
and
right?
that's, well,
Between
Christ, I'd say, is the point of convergence.
on the
Like, that's,
cross.
yeah, right, exactly. That's right. And the
Yeah,
aspect
yeah.
of the magician is like how you like you become a man of spirit that can then be connected to that point.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, but that is
Interesting.
somehow, I don't know. Like I'm thinking about when I go shepherding with when I used to go with my goats. This year I'm going to start going with my sheep, and I really literally am experiencing this art of learning, right? This contemplation that happens within space and time. I have this space and I have nothing but time, and it's just me and the sheep and whatever else is going on and whatever else is around me, right? And that is where I learn, which is the art of learning, to contemplate. That is where I've learned to do that. And I did it without knowing it.
Mhm.
It just happened. Suddenly I was learning things, right? I would look at this and that and the other thing, and then I'd get some weird insight about the Trinity or something, or Christ's humanity or all this stuff, right? And I'd be like, I didn't even, I'd take that home and I'd chew on it, and and then I started having this feeling like I need to go. I can't wait to get my chores done so that I can go out with the goats, right? I loved it. I wanted to go out with the goats and sit on a log for a long time, And so when I think about it in that context, this diagram that he has is actually the where that within, in time and space, because me, I have this body thing, right? So these, I'm bodied, the world is bodied, and it's like these forms that George MacDonald is talking about, these images, right? And it's through contemplation of all that I have this, within time and space, that I have this relationship to God.
Right. And the things he's talking about really are things that like are very embodied things, like the examples he uses throughout. And the magician, like even the image of the magician, it's a very embodied activity to perform, magic, right? It involves, great bodily dexterity, and coordination and all those things. So it's a very embodied activity. And
It's on the fingertips.
I had a discussion on angels recently, with um, Father Big Mac, from the Discord, and I read Rupert Sheldrake's book on the physics of angels in preparation for that. And one of the things that was talked about in that book is how the angels rejoice at our ability to bring forth these works into the world, which reminded me of like what Bulgakov says in Sociology of Death, and also in Jacob's Ladder, his book on angels, that one of the key differences between the angel and the human is that the human being has a world.
Mhm.
So
And a body.
and right, and that's what it means to have a world, is that's you can't have a world without having a body. So the angels are kind of like vicariously taking joy in our interaction in the world because they're deeply connected to us. Because Bulgakov also talks about like the co-humanity of the angels and the co-angelicity of human beings as well.
Mhm.
So
Well,
But
I
the
think that's like that
Mediations,
concentric participation again. Like it's bodies within bodies within bodies within bodies. Like you can go down to like the cellular level. The cell is a kind of a body.
oh, for
It
sure.
exists within a body so we're that conscious body that is comprised of trillions of bodies if you go down
we're
to
just a
the
pattern.
quantum level, right?
It's a
And
pattern.
that goes up to the higher level into like we are, like the angels are, in a sense we are concentrically related to them in a very interesting way as well. And when you find that place, like Michael was talking about, that pocket, that artistic creative place where you become kind of like a satellite beacon of that participation in the divine presence. It's coming out from you or from the group of people, from that centralized location to the periphery in that concentric reality. And I think that's part of like how the
And
angels
to me, this
rejoice.
is that activity is the deepest possible meaning of our being in the image of God, because that is that nothing else does that other than a human being that actually has the capacity to co-create with God and actually bring forth something new into the world.
So back to the magician image, he's holding the ball and the stick at the very edges of his body, at the very tips of his finger, right? Like he's just
right. And also he mentions
millimeters
that
of
his hat is in the
strength.
shape of the infinity symbol.
Right.
Which is and that's right too, because human creativity is properly infinite, even though we're finite beings, which is mind-boggling. How can that be?
Imagination, I think.
Well, it can be because we're in the image of God. That's how.
Yeah. Well, imagination is the imaging forth, and it's the access into that divine infinity that we participate. We're partakers of that divine nature.
Right.
And then, but the act of creativity is how that is actualized.
Right. Exactly. Which is the most divine things that humans are capable of doing, because that's what God does.
It's incarnation.
He actuates potentiality in this, and we actually have the same capacity to take like this field of infinite potential and out of it to make something actual.
Well, I think that's where Sophia connects into Eros, right?
Yes.
Because like we that's modeled in our human sexuality of, you know, that union is productive of a new thing comes into the world as a result of that union. But if you take just eroticism outside of the realm and domain of sexuality into the creative domain of co-creation,
Right.
because eroticism is always co-creative. It's never
about,
coming from you alone. It's coming from you.
Artists talk about their works as children all the time, and of talking about the artistic process in terms of giving birth. Like, why do you think they use that language? Because it's true. At a very deep level, it's true.
Yeah.
So that's how we can understand precisely in the way in which we are children of God. We are children of God analogously in the same way that the artistic works of human artists are their children.
Yeah, if we're children of our Father, and our Father is a creator, then, you know, we're like Jesus talks about. It's very interesting when he says, "I'm about my Father's business."
Right.
Well, what is he doing? Well, he's creating the world.
Yes.
Well,
Exactly. Yes.
Dave's book, The Meaning of the Creative Act, if you know that book, it's all about that. And he talks about all these different domains, which are creative domains. Philosophy is one of them. Science can be one of them. Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, and that science, like, and I think that's a kind of a through line in your work, Michael, is like the kind of this, you have a pretty blistering critique of the sciences as they stand, because it's being divorced from creativity.
Thank you.
Well, but here's the thing, but Tomberg actually nails exactly what's wrong when he talks about analogy and the inductive method. And he points directly toward a return to analogy to be what's needed to actually restore the sciences. And that's a home run as far as I'm concerned. That's exactly it.
You know what? I just want to mention this, Nate, because you know my story of the glowing orbs. Oh, hang on just a second. That's okay. When I read that on, where is that? What page is that on?
It's toward the end of the chapter, maybe 17, 18, something like that.
16, page 16.
Oh, 16. I was close.
Yeah, so he says, here's an example of an argument by analogy. Andrew is formed from matter, energy, and consciousness. As matter does not appear with his death, but only changes its form, and as energy does not disappear, but only modifies the mode of its activity, Andrew's consciousness also cannot simply disappear, but must merely change its form and mode or plane of activity. Therefore, Andrew is immortal. That was exactly the way I thought through that thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
As a 5-year-old.
30 years ago, I wrote touche right in the
There you go. Yeah, the part I was thinking about is a little bit after that. The ideal science, according to Keynes, is to find the means to elaborate the scope of known analogies so far as to be able to do without the hypothetical method of pure induction, i.e., to transform the scientific method into pure analogy based on pure experience. That's it, and that's what Goethe was talking about.
Yeah. It's
Well, that's even what like Heisenberg and Schrodinger are kind of pulling out in their scientific discoveries, is that what science has abstracted is the person, right? And you have to account for yourself in
Right.
the science has to come from you in a sense, like the
right.
and
So it's
like
literally cut half of the it's literally cut half of the possible avenues of experience out of the equation,
yeah,
if not more. Because
yeah. Well,
ultimately, it may be even worse than that, because ultimately our personal experience is ultimately a filter for everything.
right. Well, science has always struggled with that, like, or modern science has really struggled with that. Is it loses. So with every scientific discovery is this profound ignorance of the personal implications of that discovery, right? So like we have unlocked the power of the atom, which is really truly a powerful, amazing discovery. But because we didn't understand and we're not looking at the personal implications of that discovery, we have used that technology in a way that threatens viability of life on our planet, right? And that's the legacy of the sciences, because of it's not that the discovery of that technology in itself was wrong, but there was something wrong with us as we were discovering.
Well, but it's a disconnection from our own internal subjective experience that's causing all of that. Like that's what it is.
That's what David Bowman's criticism was, is that scientists, by pretending they're outside of nature, create all these, everything they create, or I mean, almost everything, becomes a problem for nature, because you know,
right.
It's nuclear energy. Nuclear is a great thing we devised. Okay, then Fukushima.
Right.
And then you have to create another kind of technology to fix the mistakes created by the last technology. And it's a never-ending cycle that way.
Yeah. So all those efforts to make the world better, but from that kind of being abstracted from the world, until you can kind of like, John Donne and No Man is an Island, until you can see yourself as involved in the story.
Right.
And that your discovery is a part of the world itself.
I mean,
there's a sacred responsibility that the sciences have, that because they have no sense of the sacred, they can't even touch upon. It's not that the things that they're discovering, whether that's, Big Bang cosmology, theory of evolution. I mean, you see what, like Darwin's discovery leads to social Darwinism. Well, that's a problem, right? Is Darwinism a problem? Well, maybe there's some flaws in the theory, but it was a great theory. It helped us discover a lot of things. But again, that's the fraught nature of human knowledge. We are always going to the epistemological question, and it ties into exactly what you're saying, is it's divorced from love.
Right.
So because it is outside of the context of love, which I think is the foundational movement of consciousness, is not knowing, it's loving.
Right.
Like, you can't really know something unless you love it.
Well, all those things are they're aimed toward the acquisition of power.
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah. How can I use this?
Talk about disorder.
Yeah.
And we need to have that understanding to understand hierarchy in the proper way too, because you can still have a notion of hierarchy so long as the basis of that hierarchy is love, because then the hierarchy is based on what is good for the other. So like, I mean, it's proper for a parent to be over their children, so long as that parent is actually acting as a loving parent and is genuinely trying to help to grow this person into a person.
Well, in that hierarchy, what is, what the healthy hierarchy is typified by like reciprocity, where the unhealthy hierarchy is one of dominance and control. Right. But if you have a hierarchy premise like a parent-child relationship that is a mutual reciprocity of, the parent has a role to play, but so does the child. And that relativity and that dialectical interplay between the child and the parent then becomes one that is for the mutual benefit of both.
It's reciprocity, but not equality, which I think is what he was pointing toward in his interpretation of the myth in Cain and Abel.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that there is an underlying unity and equality, and when you lose that unified vision of the world where everything is an expression of the one thing, and there is not, there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. At the fundamental level, there's a unity there.
And that fundamental unity
sense,
is how analogy works in the first place.
Yeah.
Without that fundamental unity, then the technique of analogy doesn't work at all.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the more thorny areas of this chapter for sure. I think we could talk about that for several more hours. We're like 20 minutes past our agreed upon time. I'm happy to keep going for a little bit longer if everyone else is.
I'll feed my mother. Speaking of
well, that's very important. That's very important. Michael, thank you.
My sheep.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us, Michael, Shari, Jed.
Yeah.
Appreciate you all being here. This was wonderful.
It was a great time.
I'll have it posted soon and I'll link it. And Michael, I know you have another conversation that's coming out today with More Christ that I'm definitely going to watch that too. So
I recorded that in October.
Oh, he's a
lot younger in that one.
So yeah, I'll be watching that at some point today. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Yep. See you next time. Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.